Principal funding for Rights and Wrongs has been provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the Open Society Institute.
I'm Charlene Hunter-Gault, and you're watching Rights and Wrongs, Human Rights Television. This week, women's rights as human rights, the journey since the historic Women's Conference in Beijing. You'll hear from women who traveled to Beijing from all around the world, from Atlanta.
There's not a corner of the globe you can go and not have a responsive chord around violence, around reproductive rights, around political rights.
To Bangladesh.
We have a lot of differences within the women's movement, a lot of differences, but we seem to be able to overcome them.
To Zimbabwe.
We are creating a structure by women, for women, to look after themselves personally, to look after their families, to look after their communities.
Global Vision presents Rights and Wrongs, Human Rights Television.
There's an old Chinese maxim that women hold up half the sky. In the summer of '95, women the world over converged on China to flex their collective muscles in an attempt to shape an agenda for women's rights. There were 35,000 representatives from 189 countries, including high-profile women like the American First Lady, Hillary Rodham Clinton.
If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all.
But it was the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, which emerged as the main force behind getting human rights concerns high on the UN conference's agenda. Rights and Wrongs this week looks at women's activism on the global stage, its growing influence, its future prospects. They came from small villages and large cities, from virtually every country. Some came on this peace train, which chugged from Helsinki to Beijing, across 6 time zones. There was a feeling of exhilaration and anticipation. This trip to Beijing is actually a culmination of a much longer journey that's taken 2 decades with stops on several continents. A cavalcade of concern that's roared through UN conferences in Africa, Latin America, Europe, and now Asia, all marking the emergence of non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, as significant voices on the world scene. An outspoken former American congresswoman helped play a key role in turning a cause into a movement. Bella Abzug, famous for big hats and bigger ideas, heads her own NGO, the Women's Environment Development Organization, known as We Do.
We're advocates for women's empowerment. We advocate for women to participate in decision-making on every level of government. NGOs are really people saying what they need and want, telling it to governments, telling it to a community, telling it to United Nations, telling it to the nation and the world.
The Beijing Women's Conference was actually the 4th World Conference on Women organized by the United Nations. Activists like Bella Abzug have played a prominent role not only at women's conferences, but also at conferences organized around related issues. An Environment and Development Conference took place in Rio de Janeiro in 1992.
And it was the first place where we developed a methodology known as the Women's Caucus, in which NGOs came in and said, this is what we think these documents should look like, line by line.
A year later, they were in Vienna.
There was the Human Rights Conference, where it was finally clearly stated, and it seems almost a shame that you have to have a conference to state it, that women's rights are human rights.
Many of you have waited a long time for this moment.
As women networked, they built working relationships.
And then after that, we had this conference in '94 in Cairo, and that was on reproductive rights and development. And that was a very significant conference. It dealt with fundamental rights. It dealt with women's reproductive health, their reproductive rights, and it dealt with their social conditions.
In the aftermath of these conferences, the delegates and their groups stayed in touch and pressured their governments to implement what was agreed upon.
Who has access to which delegation?
We said, listen, we've had enough words. You know, we've had a lot of words on equality. We now want the music, which is the action. So we suggested that every country come to Copenhagen, and in the major speeches made by their heads of state, that they present what they're prepared to do. In other words, what commitments will they make? And we started to make that a conference of commitments.
All of this globetrotting paved the way for the largest, and some would add, most successful of UN conferences so far, Beijing, where, as at the other gatherings, there was both a formal meeting of governments as well as a larger forum of NGOs.
I declare the NGO Forum on Women, Beijing, 1995, open!
By the time we got to Beijing, we made this issue of commitments a big issue. And we got a lot of countries to say, in the course of their speeches, what, in fact, they were going to do. We got 90 countries out of 189 to make specific commitments.
Those commitments were translated into the conference's final documents, a 130-page encyclopedia of women's issues and human rights concerns. There was a declaration and a 12-point platform for action. It included these priorities: alleviating the burden of poverty on women, confronting violence against women, particularly domestic violence and the use of rape as a weapon of war, promoting equal sharing of family responsibilities, encouraging women's and girls' literacy and universal access to education, abolishing discrimination and prejudice against the girl child.
We did not allow, though efforts were made, as there always are by governments, to sort of back out of what they had already agreed to. We said, oh no, you agreed to that in Cairo, it now belongs in here in whatever form is relevant. You agreed to it in Rio on environment, the same thing here. You agreed to this at the social summit on economic conditions, and you have to bring it in here. The platform for action that came out of Beijing is the strongest statement, not perfect, but the strongest statement affecting women and all of their concerns that any body has ever come out with.
Multiculturalism is part of gender education. It's part of the Beijing platform.
So now the message from Beijing is being brought back home to all the NGOs through report-back sessions like this one at New York's Baruch College in April 1996, 7 months after Beijing. It's at sessions like these that the NGOs will decide when and where next to flex their muscles and extend their influence.
Gonna keep on moving forward. Gonna keep on moving forward.
NGOs live in the present and plan for the future. They believe that changes can take place, because if we change life for women, we change it for men and women. We change it for our children, we change it for everybody.
Never turning back, never turning back.
You are watching Rights and Wrongs, Human Rights Television.
The women who answered the call from Beijing came from every continent. They brought with them a wide range of local concerns and fused them together under the banner of women's rights as human rights. Independent filmmaker Prudence Hill is profiling 3 grassroots organizers from Asia, Africa, and here in America. By following these 3 women over several years, her film offers a personalized view of the emerging global women's movement and shows how the concerns of women worldwide are linked. Rights and Wrongs offers a preview of this work in progress.
Passion of my life is to improve the accessibility and quality of reproductive health care for women, particularly for women in Bangladesh, which is my country.
My mother sang this song and said to the African women, you must articulate your own needs because nobody else can articulate your needs for you. You are the only ones who know what your needs are and who understand them.
The stories we got to tell ain't just our stories. They're the story of every poor woman everywhere in the world.
My name is Loretta, and I want to know how many of us out here are pissed. Come on,
I see human rights as the ideological connection, moving the women's rights as human rights movement forward to being universalized.
You begin to see a string which is common to everything.
There is a lot to learn from the grassroots women.
It's a basic human right of every person to be able to make a choice about their fertility.
Sandra Kabir started the Bangladesh Women's Health Coalition in Dhaka 15 years ago. It provides health and family planning information as well as legal, educational, and credit services to local women.
Women have demanded that we provide basic health care services for their children, immunization services for their children, basic health care services for women. They have demanded that they want functional literacy classes. They have demanded they want to know how they can get the information on ways to keep their family healthy. It's not that we sit here in this office in the capital and think, well, this is quite a nice idea, let's just do it. No, it's because we have our ear to the ground.
We are creating a structure by women, for women, to look after themselves personally, to look after their families, to look after their communities by being involved in community development.
Since 1981, Sukai Holland has been working with village women in her homeland of Zimbabwe, helping to link their local organizations with the Nationwide Association of Women's Clubs.
The grassroots women said, you come to the clubs to get skills for your hands, to look after yourself economically, to improve yourself economically, to improve your capacity to look after your family, and to be involved in community development effectively with knowledge, with information, with skills. The grassroots woman lives for other people. She lives for her husband, for her children, for her community, and at the national level, she is the one who is actually producing wealth. Trying to get to be involved in development in today's world, joining other nations, other continents, other countries into the 21st century, well prepared from the grassroots.
Sister Love really just started out as an organization that wanted to care for women who are HIV.
6 years ago in Atlanta, Loretta Ross and a friend founded Sister Love with a credit card and an unemployment check. Its mission was to provide adequate health services to poor women at the grassroots level.
Sister Love is an HIV/AIDS organization centered around women's needs, women focused, women ran, No decisions are made or created without the input of the women we serve, we take care of.
All of our organizations came out of meeting unmet needs. We would not start programs to help women who have AIDS if our governments were delivering enough services to the women who had AIDS. We would not start our clubs if the governments to whom we pay our taxes were already meeting those needs.
We are really trying to link up international meetings about development.
It's been the women's movement that has totally redefined the role of NGOs in having an impact on governmental policies.
Have you all gotten copies of the principles proposed by the Women's Caucus?
With the platform of action, we are able to move forward, telling our government that you have signed and agreed to this document.
The abuses that women of color face in the United States are largely unknown.
I see human rights as the ideological connection, moving the women's rights as human rights movement forward.
The women's movement is already beginning to show the way about the concept of more equitable distribution of resources.
The process that is being followed by IMF and the World Bank is that of completely recolonizing Africa.
We have a lot of differences within the women's movement. A lot of differences, but we seem to be able to overcome them. We maintain those differences, but we still maintain the strength of the movement.
There's not a corner of the globe you can go and not have a responsive chord around violence, around reproductive rights, around political rights, around the human rights of food and shelter and stuff like that. I mean, we have the model movement for social change, I think.
Rights and Wrongs is now online. Please be in touch with us by email and visit our internet site on the World Wide Web.
What happens now? On one level, advocates for women's rights have accomplished a great deal. Their issues have been recognized. But for the majority of the world's women, change is slow and elusive. Governments have agreed to make changes, but many argue that the gap between rhetoric and performance remains wide. India's Vandana Shiva, an economist, is a leading NGO activist. We invited her to share her perspectives about the movement's future. Vandana Shiva, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Shani.
Do you agree with the general assessment that women in non-governmental organizations came out stronger after the Beijing conference?
I think each time women from the grassroots have gathered in large numbers, their strength has been multiplied. What something like Beijing does is increase their confidence, remind them they are not fighting alone. So the issues really are pre-Beijing. They get consolidated in Beijing. Something like Beijing helps those movements draw new strength because they're people like us who work with the grassroots come away more confident about getting our agendas through, keeping the basics on the table, keeping life on the table, and not subjecting life to the logic of the dollar.
One of the impressive things about the Vienna Human Rights Conference and Beijing was the extent to which women across geographical, social, economic, cultural boundaries came together, submerging often differences. Do you see that spirit of cooperation still happening, especially when it comes to, say, Western women or women from the developed world, the industrial societies, and women in the developing and less developed societies?
Sisterhood is definitely global, but sisters are different. But sometimes women in more privileged positions where they have privileged jobs, where all their basic needs are met, they don't have to worry about food, they don't have to worry about water, can forget that women's human rights in the third world include their basic rights to food and water and shelter, that women's human rights include the freedom to determine their economies and their political structure, and that is part of a new sensitivity that we need in this new globalized world, while we remember that sisterhood is global, to recognize that some of our sisters are being robbed of the little bit they have.
Is this globalization of the economy, about which you've written and spoken a great deal, does it have greater implications, you think, for women and for human rights issues in general?
I think it does in a very, very serious way. Women are hurt more than anyone else because of the kind of division that patriarchy left us with. It is women in every society who were looking after sustenance. They were looking after water, after food, after shelter, providing for their children and their communities. That is what is under assault now. We might have more Pepsi and Coke floating in the world, but there's less drinking water in India's villages. We might have more shrimp being traded, but there's less fish for the Indian coastal communities. And it is the women who know when that disappearance happens, because they are the ones who have been responsible for food. They are the ones who have been responsible for water. So they're turning their special responsibility into a new ground of protest against a system that has totally marginalized basic needs of people, to food, to water, to shelter.
What are some of the solutions?
We need to seriously adjust our economic logic, including the global economic logic, to the imperatives of ecological survival and the imperatives of economic production in the women's perspective, which I believe is diverse, it's pluralistic, it's very rich. We will protect our biodiversity, that's our right and it's our responsibility, and we want economic and political systems in which we have a place to do this.
Technology is said to be empowering now grassroots movements, non-governmental organizations, women. Is there another side to that, though? Because you've argued that there is a downside, a negative aspect to it.
It depends on what grouping of technologies one is talking about. I believe there are two groups of technologies that are emerging in today's time. The biological technologies, biotechnologies, and the new information technologies. The communication technologies so far in the current system, organized with somewhat open access, have been helpful for mobilization. But the new biotechnologies and the earlier generation of green revolution technologies in agriculture have robbed women of their value and significance and relevance to productive work. They have created new threats. The worst pesticide poisonings and pesticide hazards are third world women, including to the extent that even mother's milk is loaded with DDT. And I think we need to seriously look at that side and not just look at the promises from the biotech companies alone.
Finally, Ms. Shiva, what do you see now as the biggest problem confronting women in the world today?
I think the biggest challenge before women is to shift the logic of the political and economic structures that are excluding larger numbers, and to put the agenda of inclusion not just for themselves alone, but all other excluded groups, which would include third world people. I think the challenge for women is now to, in a way, lead the movement for inclusion.
Well, Vandana Shiva, thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you for watching Rights and Wrongs. Please share your response with us in the mail or through email. Also, check out our internet site on the World Wide Web. I'm Charlene Hunter-Gall.
Gonna work for women's freedom.
Principal funding for Rights and Wrongs has been provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the Open Society Institute. Rights and Wrongs welcomes your written comments and suggestions. You can also order a transcript for $5 or a video cassette for $29.95 plus $5 shipping and handling by writing to the Global Center, Box 311, Radio City Station, New York 10101. Checks or money orders only. Credit card holders may call 1-800-541-2535. You can also reach us by email. And please visit our website on the World Wide Web.